Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining us at the Boca Raton Synagogue in our virtual learning opportunity that we have tonight. We're very, very excited to be able to host a world-renowned author, speaker, somebody who I've looked up to throughout my career and have learned tremendously from, and very, very excited to be able to have him. Before I have the privilege of introducing Rabbi Blech, I want to thank our generous sponsors for the evening, Sarah Shandelson and family, Dr. Michael Parzan and family, who've sponsored tonight's very important talk in loving memory of their mother, Carol Parzan Tzipora Bas Yitzchak, on the occasion of her Shloshim. And it's really a great tribute to them and their families to mark her loss and to mark the milestone of her Shloshim, specifically with a learning opportunity about how we understand death, how we prepare for it for the best of our ability, and how we grieve and mourn when it comes. I want to also acknowledge the family members of Carol Parzan who are attending online, Parzan family, the Tenowitz family, and as well a recognition of the members of her old congregation in Texas, Congregation Beth Shalom, who are with us this evening. Carol was a very special woman, a creative woman, a woman who selflessly gave to all of the communities that she was part of and left a legacy that we in our community have benefited. She passed on to her son and daughter in our community, Sarah Shandelson, the Shandelson family. We've certainly seen that spirit of volunteerism, of giving, of doing in extraordinary ways, and that is Carol's greatest living legacy. This evening we have the great privilege to address a difficult topic, the topic of a Jewish understanding of death. We have the privilege of welcoming Rabbi Benjamin Blech, an internationally recognized educator, religious leader, author, lecturer. He's written 19 highly acclaimed best-selling books with a combined sale of close to 500,000 copies, including, I highly recommend, the best-selling Sistine Secrets, which has been translated into 16 different languages. Rabbi Blech is a professor at Yeshiva University since 1966, was the Rav of the Young Israel of Oceanside for nearly 4 decades, continues to write not only in the books, but every week you could check aish.com, where countless around the world tune in for Rabbi Blech's latest articles that take contemporary issues and challenges and are able to address them from a Jewish perspective. And so, Rabbi Blech, thank you so much for giving of your time with us this evening. And without any further ado, it's an honor and a privilege to pass it over to you.
Thank you so much, and it is indeed my great honor to be here this evening and also to speak on a topic that really needs to be discussed, especially in this past year. I've seen one of the most fascinating lines on the year of the plague is that 2020 gave us a much greater vision and understanding of an essential of life and of death. I received this request to speak on the topic of death, and it's so beautiful on the part of a family to do this as a memorial to their beloved. And I think that they will gain, as all listeners will, a great deal of comfort and consolation from learning what Judaism has to say about this fascinating topic, and also how science is at long, long last, and medicine and doctors at long, long last, coming in great measure to the same conclusions that have been known and somewhat discussed by rabbinic leaders and sages. Let me first share with you a story in order to put this talk into perspective. Now, this goes back a long, long time when I was a young rabbi, and it was my first trip to Eretz Yisrael. I went with my wife, and on the first weekend that we were there, on Friday, as everybody there does, I picked up the Jerusalem Post. The Friday Post is a big paper, and lo and behold, I saw an ad for a special tour, and it was a tour of synagogues from various communities around the world that are totally different, that have their customs, that have different minhagim that we are unaware of, especially in the Western world. There are communities from South Africa, from God knows where, all over. And it was with a tour guide. And I said to my wife, this sounds fascinating. Let us go. We signed up and we went. And the first synagogue that we came to was indeed striking architecturally in one way that shocked me. I just couldn't understand. Built into one of the walls of the shul. I don't mean the wall up front, which shares with shuls around the world, an Aron Kodesh, the Holy Ark, in which the Sefer Torah, the Torahs are placed. Of course, it had that. But on one of the side walls, there, built into the wall, was a coffin. Now, I obviously could not understand. I'm certain this didn't contain a dead body, yet it was a regular coffin. I asked, and they said, well, why don't you ask the president of the congregation? And I did. I rushed over to him and I said, what is this? I know a shul can't have a dead body because Kohanim would be forbidden to enter. What is a coffin doing in a shul? And the man looked at me with a smile. In those days, I was a young rabbi and I looked very young. And he said, you don't understand. You're a young rabbi. Let me explain it to you. Are you unaware of the Talmudic passage and the Mishnah that says, Heveza here, be careful of three things. Histakel b'shlosha dvarim, v'yine'ato bo lidei avera. Regard carefully three things, and you won't come to sin. Dame ein bos, know where you come from. Ulonato lo holech, and where you are going. V'lifnei mi'ato selitin din b'cheshbon, and before whom you are destined to give a final accounting. What he was telling me was a passage and a Mishnah that obviously I should have known. I did know, I just didn't put it into the context of this architectural feature. The Talmud advises us that if we want to live a good life, what we ought to do is to remember where we come from, our beginnings, and then where we're going to, that we are going to have to give a final accounting before God. We are all going to die. Death is not something to be feared, but it is to be acknowledged. It is to be recognized as the ultimate reality of our lives. Our lives are a journey with a fixed destination. God determines when we leave this world, but we have a chiyuv. We have a divine command to make something of our lives that is memorable and to leave a legacy. So much so that the Talmud also has a magnificent passage that says, Shuv yom echad lifnei misoscha. Do tshuva, repent, one day before you die, so that you approach the heavenly court, knowing that you have acknowledged whatever sins you have or how you lived life incorrectly. Do that one day before you die. And then one of the students asked the obvious question, but how will I know which day that is? I don't know the day of my death, so how can I choose the day before in order to perform this mitzvah? And the rabbi in the Talmud answers, indeed, and therefore live every day as if it were your last. I want to tell you that in my community, you mentioned Rabbi Goldberg, that I was the rabbi of the Young Israel Oceanside. I can tell the story now. I don't think the names of the players will be known to anybody. I'm not telling tales out of school, but it was a powerful story for me. I had a husband and wife who had a very bad marriage, and they fought constantly. Not only fought within their home, but fought so that screams would emanate from their house quite often. There were scenes I don't want to repeat, but everybody knew that it was a horror. And one day they had this very bad fight as the husband was about to leave to the Long Island Railroad to go to work. And on his way out, his wife cursed him. People heard this. And she screamed, "Why don't you drop dead?" And a few minutes later, he did just that. He died on the way to Long Island Railroad. And his wife became hysterical. And his wife started to scream. And then she said something which she continued to say and says to this very day. But I didn't know that he was going to die. What struck me about that is that in saying that and hoping that she would have realized this, she was admitting that there was a reality that is universal that she never thought of. I didn't know he was going to die. The Onion is a humorous newspaper that you can see online. And it says, the rates of mortality in the world, according to statisticians, continue to remain at 100%. We die. Every one of us dies. And what the Talmud was saying, and what that shul with the coffin was saying, is that an awareness of that reality ought to make a difference to us in the way in which we live. Now, 2020 was a horrible year, and people of all ages died. Many, many of them unexpectedly. And what a tragedy for the unexpected to occur without the opportunity for not only tshuva, repentance, but for some obvious things where people didn't have a last opportunity to say goodbye to their loved ones, to kiss their wives, their children, to say goodbye to their grandchildren. All of these are things that in living our lives, we don't think about, because Jeffrey Gorer said there's only one last pornography in the United States today, and perhaps in the world. Sex is no longer something that's forbidden or not talked about. The last pornography, Gorer said, is death. We just refuse to take it seriously. We just refuse to acknowledge it. And in Judaism, you know that on Pesach night, we wear a kittel. You know that on the high holy days, we wear a kittel. It is the garment of the dead. It is a way of saying that when we acknowledge on Pesach that we are God's people and God redeemed us from Egypt, it was for a purpose. When we on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur pray to Hashem and try to analyze and evaluate our lives, it is to be with an understanding of our mortality. So having told you those few little stories, I need to tell you yet one more very personal story before I give you the amazing news about modern medicine and the teachings of Judaism, our faith, about what happens after we die. It's hard for me to tell this story because it brings back a memory that you will immediately recognize as one of the hardest things anyone can ever face. And looking at me right now, I'm sure you'll find it difficult to believe that it happened to me 8 years ago. I went to my doctor for my annual physical examination. At the end of it, he said, Rabbi Blech, I need to tell you something, but I have to say it to you together with your wife. My wife had not gone with me for the physical. It was a regular thing I did every year. It was not a big problem. Call her and wait in the office until she gets here, and then I want to speak to the both of you together. It took about 3/4 of an hour until my wife got there and we came inside. And the doctor said, Rabbi, I don't know how to break this to you. You are suffering from a very serious illness, which is critical and has no cure. For those of you who are doctors or who would recognize it, cardiac amyloidosis. Amyloids are very bad things. And when they hit the brain, you get Alzheimer's. When they hit the heart, the walls of the heart become hardened. And in about 6 months, you die. You can imagine what I felt like. Now, I need you to know, in spite of the fact that I am here, that the diagnosis was not a misdiagnosis. The doctor to this day goes to medical conferences and he talks about cardiac amyloidosis. He says it is a killer. He says all the things that doctors say about how quickly one usually passes away. And he adds the following. He says, except I had one man at a rabbi where the walls of his heart started to harden, and at a certain point, it just stopped. Medicine cannot explain what happened and why. I have my own firm belief to the answer. There are countless people who prayed for me. I said to Hillel an awful lot of it. I taught and I continue to teach, and my students tell me they need me, that I am their key to connection with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Whatever the reason, God determined that He wants me around. He wants me around for more time. You know the magnificent line that we say every morning when we thank God for returning our souls, because we believe that our souls leave our bodies to be recharged. Our neshamas get recharged in Shemayim, then they come back. We say, Moda'an lefanecha, thank you, God, for returning my soul. Bechemla rabba emunosecha, with great compassion is your faith. And that's peculiar, because we normally should speak of our faith in God. And what does emunosecha mean? Your faith. How can we say to God, your faith? What faith does God have? And the answer is that God has faith in us, obviously. If He returns our soul, that we will do something worthwhile with it. And that would justify His returning our neshama to us every day. Whenever we get our soul back, it's because God is saying, I want you to complete your mission here on earth. Now, the point that I want to make to you is that when I suddenly realized that I was mortal, my life changed. One should theoretically say, what do you mean when you realize that you are mortal? Of course, we are all mortal and we're all going to die. But we don't want to really comprehend it. We don't want to put it into our minds. I say to you that I am a better person since I heard that decree. I am far more understanding. I look aside from a lot of the pettiness of life that I used to think was overwhelming. Knowing that you're going to die is a great liberator, is a wonderful way in which you can change and alter your life. And with that, I would like to now tell you that although we are going to die, we have a great comfort in the knowledge that Judaism tells us of what happens to us afterwards. Whatever I said to you now, until now, was by way of preface, and I understand the time limitations I have. But when this occasion, recognizing that Carol Tzipora Posen left this world, we need to know that according to every teaching of our faith, that is not the end of our existence for a simple reason. We were created, as the Torah tells us, in the following way. God took of the dust of the earth, meaning material, and then blew into us of our spirit, of his spirit, I should say, B'Tselem Elohim. We are created in God's image means we have a portion of divinity in us, and as God is divine and eternal, so too are we divine and eternal. There is part of us that lives on after what we call death. What is the English word for dying? Expire. Very interesting that expire comes from the Latin ex spiritus, ex out, spiritus breath. I've been present when people died, and you see that last breath. When that last breath goes out, we say the person is dead. That breath is the original breath that God blew into us that gave us a soul. And the moment of death is returning the soul to God. We have a guf, a body, and we have a neshama, a soul. Let me clarify that further by way of a mitzvah that represents our response to death that you are all aware of. When someone was beloved to us, the connections, the 7 close connections, we rip kriya. We rip a garment. And some people think it's just ripping, giving vent to our upset, to our anger, if you will. In Kabbalah, there's a much deeper explanation. You see, I am wearing a suit. If I rip that suit, I have torn something that is external to me. I didn't really change. I'm still me. Of course I'm me. My essence remains. My suit is what was damaged, and Kriya is the symbol of what happened, because the relationship of a suit to a body is the same relationship between the guf and the neshama. The guf, the body, is the suit of my soul. But when my body expires, it means the breath of divinity, the breath which by definition is divine and immortal, has left its combination merger with my body and now went somewhere else. And I'll discuss that with you in a moment. Do you know that the worst name that we have for someone who violates and rejects Judaism is an Apikoros? And Apikoros comes from somebody's name, Epicurus. And Epicurus is known for the philosophy of eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you will die. Which means, if you believe there is nothing after this world, after this life, if you believe when it's over, it's over. Yogi Berra said it ain't over till it's over. What if it's over? What if you're gone? Is it really over? Well, it ain't over when it's over. It is not over. I hope what I'm doing right now is the opposite of the word expire. Expire is when the breath of God goes out. When I tell you a Dvar Torah, when I tell you something that moves you, when I tell you something that speaks to your neshama, I am inspiring you. Inspire is to give you more of that breath of God that represents his eternal existence. Now, let me tell you what has been happening in the medical scene in the past 50 to 100 years that relates precisely to this issue. I know that there are doctors, many, who are going to say to you that whatever I'll be telling you is merely anecdotal. That's true. There are some things that God chose not to reveal, and yet he revealed it via Kabbalah, via tradition, via hints in the Torah, which make clear what we believe about the neshama and the eternity of soul. Let me first go to something that has been happening more and more as a result of the progress in modern medicine. It used to be that when people died, they were gone and that was the end of it. Today, there are many, many occasions when, after a person's heart stops beating, after even brainwaves cease, and we would say the person is dead, with modern medicine, there are many occasions when people can be brought back. And perhaps the person who first wrote about this is a doctor by the name of Raymond Moody, who wrote a book called Life After Life, whose essence I want to explain to you. Raymond Moody, as a doctor, taught courses in a medical university to prospective doctors. And one time, he surprised his students and he said, I normally should only be speaking of things that can scientifically be proven, but I had an experience. I want to share it with you. I can't prove it, but I'd like you to be aware of it, and perhaps more can be done in pursuing whether there is validity to this or not. He said, I personally died. And by the word died, he meant what I suggested before. He meant that his heart had stopped, they pronounced him dead, and his brainwaves had ceased. But they continued to work on him, and they brought him back. And he said, a strange thing happened to me. And he described that the first thing that he was aware of was himself out of body, looking down at the doctors who were working on him. He said he heard them speaking. He could repeat what he heard. He then saw a great, incredibly beautiful source of light to which he, obviously his spirit, not his body, started to ascend. And as he did so, he realized that he was very, very quickly reviewing his life. He saw it as if it were a movie, but playing at rapid speed. And he could recognize himself from infancy, youth, teenage, married, old. He said the souls of his departed parents came to him and told him not to worry, and told him he was going to a beautiful place. And then it stopped. As he was moving forward, he said, all of a sudden, I was told, go back. The next thing I knew, I was in my body and I was alive. But he said it was as real to me as my talking to you right here. And he then asked his students to see if they could follow up on that. And also, he decided to speak about this subject many times. And a fascinating thing happened to him and subsequently to me when I spoke about this. He said there wasn't a single time that he spoke about this issue and talked about these things that seem spooky, weird, strange, that there weren't people who came over to him afterwards and said, you know, what you described is exactly what happened to me. I had a similar experience. Now, I want you to note something extremely important. Never, Moody said, and never, I'm telling you, when I would speak about this and talk about the survival of the Neshama, the soul afterwards and talk about the fact that there is consciousness afterwards and awareness afterwards about Neshama. If I spoke to at least a group of, if there were at least 100 people or more, invariably, same thing that happened to Moody, invariably, someone would come over and say, that happened to me, but never, when I spoke, did anyone ever in the middle raise his hand and say, Rabbi, you're describing what happened to me. And I would ask people afterwards, many times, how come you never said anything during the lecture? Or how come when there were question and answers, you didn't say that? The response was, well, I think people would think that I was crazy. People would think that I'm nuts, and I didn't want people to look at me that way. Because it seems that it is still considered weird. It's still considered unscientific. It's still considered something that probably can't be, and he's just imagining things. These are now called near-death experiences, or NDE, and there are hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of recorded cases, and some of them are beyond belief in terms of additional factors. Let me tell you some of them. Let me tell you that in Eretz Yisrael, a number of years ago, the Jerusalem Post did a piece, an article on Raymond Moody and the findings that he claimed, or at least that he spoke about. And on Saturday night in Israel at the time, this goes back several decades, Rabbi David Halevi, who was the chief rabbi of Tel Aviv, had a program, radio program. Now, countless people read the Jerusalem Post on Friday, and they had read this. Lo and behold, Rabbi David Halevi in his program had open questions and answers. And what does Judaism say about? And countless people said, we read this piece in the Jerusalem Post. Does Judaism say anything about this? Is there any truth to this? And Rabbi David Halevi said that every single thing that Moody had described and more is part of Jewish tradition, is written in Kabbalah, is not usually taught for a reason that I will discuss with you in a few moments. But everything is in agreement with what we believe occurs after death, in particular, the survival of the Neshama. I spoke about this in Houston, Texas, and many members of the audience were doctors. Houston, it seems, attracts a ton of Jewish doctors. And one of them said to me, you might be interested in knowing that they passed a rule a few years ago affecting us, affecting doctors who perform surgery and deal with life and death matters. He told me that they got complaints. There were people who died on the operating table and then were brought back to life. And a number of them said, I was very disgusted, doctor. I was dying. I saw myself from above. I saw and I realized that I was dead, and you doctors were telling jokes. It was true that doctors sometimes, I guess in order to deal with the difficulties and the morbidity of the situation they find themselves in, attempt humor as a way to cope. But they were dead and they heard. I know I'm saying they were dead and you're telling me they weren't dead, but by all ways in which we determine death, including brain waves, they could not possibly have heard, and yet they repeated the jokes. In Israel, one story stands out that was discussed by David Halevi. It was on the air. There was a man who, when he was about 6 years old, became blinded. When he, in his 40s, had an NDE, a near-death experience, and he saw himself out of body, he subsequently talked about the people who came to resuscitate him and described what they looked like and the color of the clothing that they wore, which is impossible. Incredible. Let me share with you a fascinating shaila, a rabbinic question. It's related to Pesach that we just celebrated, and it makes the point in yet another way. This is a story that happened in the shtetl about 100 years ago. There were two friends, Moshe and Chaim. They loved each other. They did everything together. Their families got along perfectly until, need I tell you, machlokas rears its head, and they had a fight. What it was about doesn't matter. A minor thing, but it was a fight that so embittered Moshe that Moshe said to Chaim, I never want to see you again. And I swear, now an oath is a very powerful thing. I swear to God that I will never look at your face again. They had been davening in the same shul. He went to a different shul. Whenever there was a fair, they were both invited to a mitzvah, wedding, whatever. Moshe made sure that he did not attend if Chaim was going to be there. He kept his oath, and he never looked at him again for years, until one day Chaim, in spite of his name, passed away. And it was then all of a sudden that Moshe said, oh my God, he was my dear friend. And why was it so important? And what was the big deal with the argument? I wish I could in some way show that I do tshuva, that I repent of the anger and the animosity and the lack of friendship. There must be something I can do. And then he thought, I know what I will do. In order to show my true feelings now, I would like to serve on the Chevra Kadisha. The Chevra Kadisha, you know, are those who prepare the body for a proper religious funeral. That is called a Chesed Shel Emes, a kindness of truth. It's the kindness of ultimate truth because you'll never get paid back by the person you do the favor to. It's a pure kindness. And so he volunteered to be on the Chevra, but the rabbis had a huge problem because he had made an oath. He would never again look at him. And if he is going to help in dressing him, preparing him, doing the purification process, he will be voiding that oath. Or perhaps not, because the person is dead, so maybe that's not really him. And so they brought it to the rabbis, and the rabbis had discussions, and they went back and forth, and they threw around a Tosfos and a Gemara and a this and a that. I love the story. It's recorded, true story. And one of the Balabatim who overheard said, Rabbis, I don't understand. This is an open and shut case. This is in the Torah. There's a simple proof from the Torah. And they said to him, what is the proof? And he said, well, when the Jews were standing at the sea and the Egyptians were coming towards them, God promised them, Kasher Isem es Mitzrayim Hayom, as you see Egypt today stacked against you, ready to attack, Lo Risem Od Ad Olam, you will never see them again. You will never see the Egyptians again. And then a few sentences later, we are told the Egyptians drowned. The sea cast them out to the other side. In fact, according to Rashi and the Midrash, every Jew saw his own oppressor, saw the person who had tormented him. And Israel saw Egypt dead on the banks of the sea. So they saw them. How could God have promised you'll never see them again? That proves that seeing somebody when he's no longer alive is not seeing him or her. It is simply seeing the suit, the outer garment. I can't see you now. Even if I were to see you, even if I would have had the good fortune of coming down to Boca and having your weather now, which I would have loved to do. You are all different. Everybody looks different. And that is a miracle in and of itself, that God created everybody with their own individuality and with their own physical appearance. But your physical appearance is not you. Now you know that inside. I know I'm me. You see me and my face. But that's not the real me. You don't know me yet. Me is my inner me. And how can I describe the me? The me is the breath of God. The me is the Tzelem Elokim. The me is the Neshama. My body is not me. And death is the end of my body, a return of my body which served me. But thank God it continues to serve me for as long as God chooses to leave me here on earth. But the real me is Tzelem Elokim. The real me is the image of God. When you, Sarah, wrote me about your mother, Carol Tzipora, and you told me some of the things that she did. Oh my God, she was a shul president. Oh my God, her abilities, her talents, teaching, all the things that she was capable of, way ahead of her times. You don't usually hear that about one of that past generation. That was her and more. And she was your mother. And she was, I don't know words really that could fully explain that identity, that essence continues, must continue by definition. Do you know why we close the eyes of a mace of someone who just died? Because the Torah says, Lo Yirani ha'odam v'choy, man cannot see me and live, from which we deduce that, however, when we die, the last glimpse that we have of reality is a glimpse of God, a vision of God. The eyes that have seen God should no longer be contaminated by visions of this worldliness. The Neshama lives on. We live on. And there are countless men of medicine who are being forced to admit that truth. It's anecdotal, yes, but it is a truth. And it is something that Chazal, our sages, knew for the longest time and wrote about. It's not written in the Chumash, though. In the Chumash, the Kabbalists say the first letter of the Torah is a bet. Now, let me do this for you. I hope that if I'm doing it this way, you will This obeys is this. I'm getting this, this, this. Said the Kabbalists. The Torah is going to tell us a great deal, but what is above, what is below, what came before, or closed off? That's not for us to know. And I want to tell you, and I still hopefully have the time to share with you this last powerful story, which I think is the best answer to, well, if all this is true, why didn't the Torah tell us? Why isn't that really written up in a manner that would make us see the coffin in the synagogue, be aware, understand that? So I'm going to condense the story because of limitations of time and tell you that it's on YouTube and you can look it up, and Rabbi Benjamin Blech and Ernest Hemingway. But I will tell you the gist of the story. I don't know why in my life I've had the opportunity to have some incredible experiences, especially with people who are known worldwide. I have met the Pope. I was involved in stories about getting items back that the Vatican has that belong to the Jewish people, and that's what the Rabbi indicated is part of the book of the Sistine Secrets. I have met and spent time with Lubavitcher Rebbe. I met Ernest Hemingway, and the gist of the story is this. When I became ordained, I got smicha. 2 other young men who were, I dare say, at the top of the class. We decided, the 3 of us, that we needed a vacation. Today, kids go all over the world. We wanted to be exotic. Well, we weren't just going to go to Miami. Let's go to Cuba. This was pre-Castro Cuba. We hired a Yiddish-speaking taxi cab driver who we thankfully found. And one day the driver is going past this magnificent estate. And we looked at it in wonderment. We said, wer wohnt du? You know, who lives here? What could this possibly be? And the cabbie said, Du wohnt Ernest Hemingway. Here, Ernest Hemingway lives. And we said, stop the car. And he said, no. He said Yiddish, but I'll just, nobody gets in to see Ernest Hemingway. And with the chutzpah of youth and a daring imagination, I said to the cabbie, you'll see. We walked over to the guardhouse, and I had this great idea. And I said to the guard, would you kindly tell Mr. Hemingway 3 rabbis from New York are here to see him? Hemingway was going to say, 3 rabbis are here to see me. What? Who could this possibly, what do they want? Or maybe he might say, this is the key to a story that I could write, whatever. He was intrigued enough to shock the guard by saying to him, I'm with the American ambassador right now, but I'll see them in half an hour. Tell them to wait, which we did. Half an hour later, we get inside. He begins to talk to us, and he's quite cold, but he is obviously giving us a test to see if we're anybody that he should waste his time talking to. And he wanted to know what our interpretations were of some of his books. I was an English major, and the other 2, brilliant, as I said. Bottom line, we truly impressed him. And about 15, 20 minutes into our conversation, which had been on one level of coldness, suddenly turned. He said, you know what? I was just testing you guys. But you're somebody I'd like to talk to. And I want to tell you something. And then he said, I'm not known as a theologian or even interested in the religion the slightest bit. People don't know this about me. But I have been very often intrigued by different religions. I've studied them. And sometimes I even took a couple of days and tried to live by their teachings to see if they would influence me in any way. He said, in my studies, I've come to a conclusion about Judaism. And he said something that is so brilliant that most Jews, I would dare say, are not sensitive to it. But he perceived it. He's a Pulitzer Prize winner, Nobel Prize winner. He said, as far as I can see, Judaism is different than any of the other religions that I have studied in this way. All the other religions emphasize death, and their teachers and teachings are involved with preparing for death. Judaism is the only religion that I have seen, that I know of, that's concerned primarily with life and how to live life. I said, Mr. Hemingway, if you will allow me, I'd like to elaborate on that and tell you something that validates exactly what you just now said. In the Bible, in the Torah for us, the Kohanim, the priests, were the original rabbis. They were the spiritual leaders. And there's a remarkable law that Kohanim, the Jewish priests, the Jewish rabbis, were not to be permitted to come into contact with a dead body. They could not come into contact with death. And there's no reason given. But the commentators do give a reason. And they say in that way, the spiritual leaders of Judaism were forced not to emphasize death, but rather to teach life, not to talk about what happens after we leave this world, but to stress how we can bring heaven down to earth while we are alive. And Mr. Hemingway said to me, that is a magnificent insight. And for me, at the beginning of my rabbinic career, to receive a Yasher Koach from Ernest Hemingway, I must tell you, is beyond belief. But he himself understood that. Yes, Judaism is not a book that is going to tell us what happens after we die, because Judaism and Torah is a book of Torah mitzvahs, which says, trust in me, believe in me, be all you can be, and make your life a heaven on earth. And after that, you will be rewarded, and you'll see, and you'll find out. When the Vilna Gaon, the Gaon of Vilna, was on his deathbed, he was crying. And his students asked him, Rebbe, why are you crying? You know, you believe what the Mishnah says. And the Mishnah tells us 1 hour of joy in the world to come beats all the years of happiness of life on earth. So why should you be crying? You know for sure, you know you're going to heaven. And the Vilna Gaon said, how can I not cry when I leave a world where with the slightest of effort, I can do mitzvot and accomplish worlds and worlds, and accomplish even greater legacy, and accomplish more for the Jewish people and more for the world. His understanding of the tragedy of death is simply that it brings to an end our potential for fulfillment of ourselves, for fulfillment of our potential, for fulfillment of who we could be and do in order to make this world a better world. But in terms of death, the tragedy of death, the name of my book is Hope, Not Fear. Changing our view of death. Please read the book for whatever I was not able, by virtue of time, to share with you. And let me in particular say, because this gathering tonight is to honor the memory of Carol Tzipora, present. that she lived a life of achievement. She lived a life of greatness. I read with profound respect the remarks you sent me, Sarah, about who she was. And I tell you that you were blessed. And more important, she was a blessing. God called her back. If you want to know, is she aware of this gathering? Does she know that we came together because of her? We have a mitzvah of learning Torah in her zchut. The answer is a resounding yes. Yes to survival eternally, b'tzel Elokim. Yes to reward us for lives that we live in accord with God's will, and for the contribution that we make to the survival of the Jewish people. In the aftermath of death, we say, Yiskadal v'yiskadash shemei Rabbah. May God's name be glorified, magnified. Yehei shmei Rabbah mavarach li'olam lo me'omaya. May his name be blessed. Even though it seemingly, that prayer has nothing to do with death, it does. What it tells us is, we know that the person who passed away fulfilled the task of making God's presence on earth more manifest. Thank you for having me here tonight and for allowing me to share with you some truly important thoughts about death and dying. As a final thing, I must say to you, when I came out with a book, I received literally hundreds of phone calls from Jews who said to me, but Rabbi, my rabbi told me that Jews don't believe in an afterlife. My rabbi told me that there is nothing afterwards, according to Judaism. They were obviously not Orthodox rabbis. And that is a perversion. And that is what we call Epicurus, to believe that all of life is to eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we shall die, is to miss the entire meaning of life. And we love life, and whenever we have a drink, we say l'chaim, but we love life because it gives us an opportunity to serve and to do and to leave a legacy, and then to receive the eternal reward for our Neshama. So thank you for having me here. I don't know if there's an opportunity for you to ask questions in this format. I expected Zoom, and Zoom has that. I don't know if this is available here. If not, let me say to you that my email address is bblech, B for Benjamin, BLECH @gmail.com. And if you have any questions or comments, and you won't have an opportunity, if you don't have an opportunity here, please feel free to write to me, and I will promise you I will respond to you. So thank you, family, and thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Blech, for your insightful words, for your inspiring words. You put death, as much as we can't make it disappear, but you put it in a context which was elevating and inspiring. Of course, we encourage everyone to learn more by reading the book. We thank the Shandelzens, the Parzan family so much for their sponsorship tonight, and wish everyone a wonderful evening, a good Chodesh, and a wonderful week.